The rock scene of the 80s was dominated by male musicians with big hair, but there was one band who emerged from the scene who was an all-girl group who ended up nabbing a major recording contract and had a good deal of success despite all the obstacles they faced. I'm of course talking about the band Vixen, whose career peaked in the late 80s and early 90s thanks to their glossy image and power ballads. Today, let's talk about the early years of the group. Vixen's history begins in Minnesota in the 1970s when guitarist Jan Koo-na-mind, who according to the band's own press release, was more into guitar than dolls, starting her first band when she was just in junior high with her best friend in St. Paul. According to her own hometown paper, she would later start a band named Vixen around 1973 and would gig around popular establishments in the Twin Cities like Cabooze, Duffy's Bar, the Union, as well as others. Originally, it was just the two of them playing guitar and singing, but they wanted to expand to a full band and had aspirations of hitting it big. They would eventually find some other musicians in Minnesota and move out to Los Angeles around 1981, since of course there was a huge music scene out there and that's where all the record labels were as well. But Los Angeles was competitive and there were only so many gigs to go around, so it wasn't uncommon for bands back in the day to pay to play. It soon wasn't a surprise that one by one members of the band left, as Jan was the only remaining member. Jan, by her own admission, didn't think about how some people would react to seeing women play rock music, telling the New Jersey Record newspaper, "It was just the kind of music that was in my blood." She would cite Led Zeppelin as one of her biggest influences, adding, "Only after we started playing and everyone kept telling us how weird it was, did we realize we were unique." Jan would end up first recruiting a vocalist named Janet Gardner. Gardner would start singing in bands in high school back in Montana, and Gardner would move to LA around 1984, and at the time she was playing in several bands, including a cover band who played a show one night somewhere in the San Fernando Valley. Gardner recalled in the book Nothing But a Good Time, "On one of our breaks, some girl comes up to me and goes, 'I know this band that's looking for a singer that you would be perfect for. I know the manager. I'm going to have him call you.' I'm like, wow, they have a manager? That's pretty impressive." The manager would return the following night, and Gardner was surprised to see it was a bunch of women. Keenamin and Gardner, as well as three temporary members, would appear in the 1984 film Hard Bodies, performing as a band using the moniker Diaper Rash. They would end up writing 6 songs for the film, which was actually more songs than they wrote for their own debut record. The appearance would lead to a segment on the show Entertainment Tonight, an opening slot for the group Night Ranger, a tour of military bases in Guam, Japan, and Korea, and an appearance on the show Cagney and Lacey, but they still couldn't get a recording contract. That wouldn't happen for another several years. They would go through some more lineup changes, with the band literally having a revolving door of members, with the exception of Keenamin and Gardner, before cementing their classic lineup in 1986. It was in 1981 a drummer named Roxy Petrucci and her sister would start a band named Madam X in Detroit. The sisters were first enthralled by hard rock and metal, thanks to their older brother who brought home Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath records. Petrucci would also cite the group Fanny, which was an all-girl group, as being a big influence on her. Fun fact you guys may not know is that Sebastian Bach would end up fronting Madam X for a period of time. Roxy, who was a former classical clarinetist, she was soon splitting her time between symphony halls in the morning and afternoon and rock clubs at night, throwing on her leather clothes and teasing her hair. She initially started out playing jazz music on drums, and she would remark to the LA Times that when she started playing hard rock and metal, her hands would start to bleed. Madam X, a cover band who'd sometimes play 3 to 4 hour long sets, would perform Black Sabbath, Van Halen, and Led Zeppelin tunes, and one of the group's early fans was Judas Priest frontman Rob Halford, who was living in Phoenix, Arizona at the time. When the band came through town, he stopped by their show at a place called Rockers and hung out with them backstage and even joined them on stage for several numbers. When Madam X got to Los Angeles, they got quite a bit of attention. It would be Jet Records and Sharon Osbourne's father, Don Arden, who took notice of the group playing at the Troubadour one night, and he soon got them a management deal. They would put out their first record, We Reserve the Right, in 1984, and while things were initially good for the band, including touring Europe and even playing the legendary Marquee venue in London, And of course, meeting Ozzy Osbourne, their label soon ran into financial trouble. Disheartened, Petrucci went back home to Michigan and literally did nothing for a period of time. It wasn't until vocalist Janet Gardner got her number from an ex-Jet employee and sent her a demo tape of the band she was in at the time called Vixen. Loving what she heard, Roxy was also skeptical, wondering if these girls could actually play. But she soon headed back to Los Angeles and joined the group. At one point, Roxy would even audition for David Lee Roth's solo band, and she would admit that she did make the top of the list, but the gig eventually went to Greg Bissonette. It was in 1984 that bassist Cher Ross moved to Los Angeles from Minnesota, and she was supporting herself by being a session musician, playing with Australian pop singer Helen Reddy and with the group The Drifters, The Temptations, and The Coasters. It was around 1986 Cher wasn't having luck joining other bands, recalling how she'd respond to ads in the paper and call up bands to discuss joining them, recalling in Nothing But a Good Time. They'd say, "What, a chick in our band?" It was around this time she would join Vixen, cementing their classic lineup. The band soon hit the road in an RV doing a lot of live shows, but getting acceptance as a female band wasn't easy. Keenamin would tell the record newspaper from New Jersey, "There were a lot of people in the industry who didn't take us seriously, and a lot of times people booking us into clubs thought we were a novelty act. When we would do gigs, we'd have to prove ourselves as well as our music." Vixen would eventually record a demo and take it to manager Alan Kovac, who was already representing Lita Ford with his company Left Bank Management. So he knew about dealing with female artists. Kovac would recall in Nothing But a Good Time, "I asked one question, can you guys play? And when they said yes, I said, this is awesome. There's no rock bands that are all girls." And I told them it's a terrible business for females. Vixen soon gained a good following, and a lot of popular musicians on the scene, including Bret Michaels of Poison, Kevin DuBrow, and Frankie Banali of Quiet Riot, and others soon stopped by their shows, just out of curiosity to see an all-girl band. While getting gigs was difficult for the group, it was landing a major recording contract that proved to be the biggest obstacle. Getting signed to a major label was no easy feat. In fact, the band had to play numerous showcases only for the record labels to come up with different excuses and not take the band seriously. Some labels would say they already had a female act on their roster, or suggested they soften their sound to be more like the Bangles or the Go-Go's, or that they wear more seductive clothing on stage. The only reason Vixen would end up nabbing a recording deal was because of their manager Kovac. He was already representing two artists on EMI, including Richard Marx, and he asked the label to trust him in signing the act and promised a great first record. There was another interview the band gave where they got initially signed to Manhattan Records, who ended up later merging with EMI. The label was insistent that the band write radio-friendly songs, something that was a step lower than the type of music Vixen typically played, but the band didn't really put up much of a fight. Vixen were just happy to have a recording contract. The label would end up putting 4 producers on the record, and despite all the efforts, they were still convinced they didn't have a hit song. The label were insistent that the group work with Richard Marx, and he would end up coming up with one of the band's best-known songs, a ballad called Edge of a Broken Heart. Peterson would tell the LA Times, "We met Richard because we had the same management, and he had come to rehearsal one day and said, 'Wow, you guys sound great. I'd like to work with you someday.'" Gardner would recall how the song Edge of a Broken Heart came to be. He had a melody and some chords and a guitar riff in his head. Jan fumbled around, tried to find what he was looking for. When I went to record it, there were no lyrics yet. Fee Waybill from the Tube showed up with the lyrics. I literally had no rehearsal. But while some in the press labeled an all-girl group as a tough sell to mainstream audiences, others would point to the popularity of Joan Jett, Chrissie Hynde, Pat Benatar, and Ann and Nancy Wilson as paving the way for Vixen. As for the band using outside songwriters, they would defend themselves with Petrucci telling the Fresno Bee that we wanted to put out our best material, whether it was ours or someone else's. Richard Marx would talk to Ultimate Classic Rock and talk about how he came up with the song Edge of a Broken Heart. "I wrote that song in a heartbeat. I had to write it really fast. I wrote the music so fast in the hotel room, and I take way longer to write lyrics. I called Fee Waybill, who is not only my best friend, but one of the greatest lyricists of all time. I said, you've got to rein in your weirdness on this one. It needs to be way more commercial." He would add that the lyrics came together in about one night. Vixen's self-titled record would be released in 1988, and the band purposely didn't put themselves on the cover, instead using a shot of Jan's leg next to a motorcycle, with her telling the Star Tribune, "Sometimes people think we're just dolls, all hype and all dressed up, and we really can't play." She would add, "Listen to the music." The lead single, Edge of a Broken Heart, would peak at number 26 on the Hot 100 chart. They also had another top 40 hit with the song Cryin', with the record peaking at number 41 in the States, and it went nearly platinum, selling about 1 million copies. But landing touring spots would prove to be another problem for the band, as many groups didn't want to have Vixen open for them due to the male members' girlfriends and wives. However, they would finally get some touring spots, hitting the road with Eddie Money, the Scorpions, Ozzy Osbourne, as well as White Lion. The joke amongst the band members was that a band had to be old enough to take Vixen out on tour because younger groups were too afraid to get shown up on stage. But just because Vixen was now signed and had a couple big singles, they also toured, of course, with big name acts, they still had trouble getting respect. One review from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 1988 would write about their opening slot for Eddie Money. The band's target wasn't the intellect. The metal industry must have an affirmative action for this inane all-female band to have been signed. Vixen apes every tired riff and melody from second-rate bands like Kiss, Angel, and Triumph. And if they only knew how insane they looked, contorting themselves in all those rock star poses. Even when Vixen hit the road supporting various bands, it became commonplace for the male musicians at the beginning of each tour to stand by the side of the stage and actually see if Vixen could sing and play their own instruments and songs. Other times, the band members would admit that they were asked stupid questions by the press, with Ross telling the LA Times the kinds of questions they got, like, did Bon Jovi put you together? Did Poison put you together? Are you the girlfriends of somebody in the business? It was hilarious, she would remark. Even when the band did get praise, it seemed like it was backhanded, with Kerrang calling Jan Koo-na-mind one of the best female guitarists around. But despite what the naysayers said, the group still had a good deal of fans, including young girls who would send them fan mail telling the members that they wanted to start their own bands. This would result in Vixen's audiences also changing, with Gardner telling the Times the audiences used to be just about all male, but now it's 50-50 male and female. More females have gotten into hard rock in the last few years because the music has changed. It's more accessible to general audiences, much more song-oriented. But like so many stories in the music industry, Vixen was really no different. They had sold nearly 1 million records, and they were playing to thousands of people a night on the road, but they were flat broke. They chalked that up to just how expensive the first album was to record, how they hadn't written a lot of their own songs, so publishing had to be split, and they also spent a ton of money on their music videos. After getting off the road for their first album, Vixen took 3 months off to write new material for their follow-up record. The members had felt that their first record, because of the outside songwriters, didn't properly represent the band. Jan and Roxy would be in one camp writing their own songs with a few outside writers, while the other two members were writing their own tunes between the two of them. When attention turned to their follow-up record, 1990's Rev It Up, Ross would reveal to the Times how the band was besieged with so many offers to write songs for them, even with some of the requests coming from some unexpected places, with her recalling, when we were writing for this record, man, we were getting phone calls left and right from Holly Knight and 1,000 would-be Holly Knights. It was weird. I can remember going to my corner video store and renting a video, and the kid goes, "Wow, you're in Vixen, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." So he says, "My friend and I sent in a tape to your management. We really want to write songs for you." I was like, "Give me the video, go away." Despite touring with the likes of Kiss and Winger on their second record, their sophomore album proved to be a commercial disappointment. The band was out on the road in Europe with Deep Purple, oblivious to what was happening back home in the States. When they got back home, they were pretty surprised to see how poorly their second record was performing. Gardner would recall in the book Nothing But a Good Time, "We got home and it was kind of like nothing was happening. EMI dropped the ball. They went, well, that's how it goes." One of the reasons the label may have dropped the ball on the album may have had something to do with the fact that their manager, Alan Kovac, was renegotiating Richard Marx's contract with the label. Apparently their manager went over someone's head at EMI, To retaliate, they would apparently drop the ball on Vixen's second record. Vixen soon lost the recording contract, and while the band was still together and contemplated writing a third record, Jan and Roxy tended to write with outside songwriters, while the other pair wanted to keep the writing eternal. Also adding to the tension was that the band couldn't agree on the sound of their next record, and depending on who you ask, some members wanted to add a second guitarist or fire Jan from the group. It resulted in the band ultimately breaking up by 1991. For a short period of time, Janet and Cher would put together a new band under the direction of John Callender, but ultimately things didn't work out. And couple that with the rise of alternative rock and grunge, and well, the timing really wasn't on the side of Vixen. Ross would admit in the same book, from 93 to the end of the decade, I definitely did not lead with the fact that I'd been the bass player in Vixen. The members in the subsequent years would reunite on and off in different configurations, with Keenamin sadly passing away in 2013. The band is still around today, with drummer Roxy Petrucci being the only original member.